I jolted awake, heart thumping, at the unmistakable buzz of hedge trimmers reverberating through my closed kitchen window. It was only 8 a.m., and while I appreciated a diligent neighbor who liked to keep their grass neat, that rumble was way too close to be from down the street. It sounded like it was in my own backyard. And sure enough, when I swung open the curtains and peered outside, I spotted an orange-vested stranger hacking away at my carefully tended hedges, a swarm of people in matching vests behind him. I almost spilled my coffee all over the windowsill. There's a certain kind of primal fury that builds when you see someone decimating the plants you've nurtured for years. I have spent thousands of dollars and hours shaping those hedges to create a privacy border around my home. They weren't just bushes. They were living, breathing pieces of a life I'd built here. Now the electric whine of the trimmer pierced the air as branches and leaves tumbled in a green flurry. Throwing on a pair of flip-flops, I dashed outside, my heart in my throat. "Stop!" I yelled, voice cracking. "What do you think you're doing?" A rotund man, holding a clipboard, paused to look up from behind the two individuals brandishing the trimmers. His gray hair was slicked back, and his eyes narrowed. For a moment, it seemed he was about to ignore me entirely. Then he sighed dramatically and waved the trimmers to power down. "Ma'am, we're with the Timberwoods Homeowners Association. We have a directive that all hedges must be maintained at 4 feet high, and you've exceeded that." He reached under the sheaf of papers on his clipboard, retrieving a laminated sheet that bore the bold letters, "Timberwoods HOA Compliance Protocol. You've been sent multiple notices. This is official HOA business." I nearly choked. We had received one letter suggesting my hedges were, in the board's opinion, unduly tall, but I had no idea it would result in what I considered a trespass. Especially not so soon. "You can't just wander onto my property and hack things down," I cried, my voice rattling around the cul-de-sac. "You didn't wait for me to respond. You didn't get my permission. What if I wanted to negotiate or propose a compromise?" He smirked in a fashion that made my blood boil. "We have the right, per the HOA bylaws, to enforce compliance. As you are well aware, you forfeited some property rights when you purchased a home in this neighborhood. We've reminded you a dozen times. Any further issues, please go through our standard resolution process." My next retort stuck in my throat as I noticed that the left side of my front hedge was practically gone. A big chunk of it, branches, leaves, all scattered on the ground like a sad half-harvest. The older couple across the street, Miriam and Sam, were gawking from their driveway. Sam looked outraged on my behalf, while Miriam clutched her garden hose with a mixture of shock and pity. "What standard resolution process?" I sputtered. "I responded to your first letter with an email, but I never heard back." The man shrugged with a feigned politeness that only fueled the fury building in my chest. "I'm sorry, but apparently we did not receive it. Perhaps check your outbox or your spam folder. Now, if you don't mind, we have 4 other houses on our list, and we need to finish here." He signaled to the trimmer crew. "Proceed." I watched as my decades-old hedge was systematically chopped down to the bare minimum, leaves flying off like confetti. Furious tears welled in my eyes, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Instead, I turned on my heel, marched back inside, and slammed the door as the saw-like hum roared to life again. Little did that man know there would be consequences, not in the form of an angry letter or a strongly worded phone call. No, because as fate would have it, I had just been hired as an external auditor for the county government. My first major assignment, ironically, was to review the finances and governance of local homeowners associations, particularly those with repeated complaints against them. Timberwoods sat near the top of the list. I stared at my messy email inbox, recalling how I had hammered out a furious draft to the HOA just last week. Maybe it was stuck in some digital limbo. Regardless, I was done playing games. Perhaps the next time that officious gentleman with the clipboard saw me, he'd wear a more respectful expression. After all, the county had received multiple grievances about Timberwoods, questionable expenditures, shady enforcement tactics, fines that seemed to line the pockets of certain board members. I was expected to dig deep, examine budgets, interview the board, and prepare a detailed report. Seething, I forced myself to slow my breathing. If I was going to handle this, I needed to do it ethically by the book. My job demanded objectivity, but my battered hedges demanded justice. I had to strike a careful balance. And, oh, how I relished the thought that my official capacity might give me some kind of standing. The law might finally be on my side, and, ironically, that same HOA would be forced to open its books to me. Outside, the whine of the trimmer died down. The man's voice floated through my window, something about sending me a bill for the cost of compliance. Unbelievable. I took one last scalding sip of coffee, squared my shoulders, and made a vow. If the Timberwoods HOA wanted to play hardball, they'd pick the wrong yard this time. The day after the Hedge massacre, I got an urgent text from my friend Denise. "Heard about your Hedges," she wrote, adding a row of angry emojis. "Told you that HOA was bad news. Meet me at the cafe." Denise was a longtime resident of the Timberwoods neighborhood and a fierce critic of the Homeowners Association. She had butted heads with them years earlier over the color of her mailbox post. She'd painted it a tasteful slate gray, but the HOA insisted it had to be a specific shade of green. They'd threatened her with daily fines if she didn't comply. Denise ended up paying a hefty penalty and repainting it out of frustration, but she never forgot the injustice. When I arrived at the cafe, Denise was seated in the corner booth, nursing a latte. She wore her curly hair piled high, and her eyes flashed with determination. "I can't believe they actually barged onto your property," she exclaimed, gesturing for me to sit down. "I told you they were ruthless, but wow, that's another level." I slid into the booth, ordering a coffee, though my nerves were still too raw to really crave more caffeine. I recounted every detail: the early morning buzzing, the officious man with the clipboard, my cut-short hedges. Denise shook her head throughout, clearly appalled. "Look, I hate to say I told you so, but," she trailed off, an apologetic smirk on her face. Yeah, you were right," I said with a wry smile. "But guess what? They messed with the wrong person this time. That new auditor position I landed with the county." Denise's eyes widened. "Don't tell me." I grinned. "They're on my list. My job is to investigate questionable HOA activities, like random fines that don't match the bylaws, sudden fee hikes, expensive landscaping bills that magically benefit the board members' relatives. The county has been getting inundated with complaints about shady practices. And Timberwoods is quite the record. Fate is a funny thing." Denise took a thoughtful sip of her latte. "So, what's your plan? Because I know you, and I see that glint in your eye. You're not letting this slide." "No, I'm not. But I have to be careful. I'm supposed to be impartial, and I don't want them crying conflict of interest. However, I also have a job to do, and it just so happens that the job lines up perfectly with ensuring that they follow the law and manage their funds properly. There's no reason for me to recuse myself. In fact, if they try to pull that card, it'll only draw more attention to their questionable activities." Denise nodded, tapping a pen against her notepad. She always kept one handy for her small business brainstorming. "I hope they know that once an auditor sinks their teeth in, it's nearly impossible to get rid of them without serious justification." She paused. "I just wonder if they'll try to sabotage you. That board is known for shady moves, like sending official-looking letters that aren't legally binding or telling neighbors they have to accept certain landscaping services. They might retaliate in ways you can't predict." My stomach twisted slightly. I'd considered that they might not be thrilled with me prying into their finances, but it was another matter to imagine them actively interfering. Then I pictured the wreckage of my hedges, and a steely resolve settled over me. "Let them try," I murmured. "I'm not afraid of a few cheap maneuvers." We spent the next hour discussing experiences with the HOA and ways they'd strong-armed unsuspecting homeowners. Denise recounted how they charged her neighbor an outlandish boat storage fine because he kept a small canoe in his garage, a garage that was always shut. It was never even visible. Another homeowner was hit with random administrative fees after inquiring about installing solar panels. The pattern was clear: step out of line, ask too many questions, and expect an inflated penalty or sudden rule enforcement. When I got home, I pulled out a box from my closet labeled HOA docs. Inside were every letter, flyer, rulebook, and invoice I'd received since I moved in. I fanned them out on my desk and started reading. Even on the surface, I could sense inconsistencies, language that contradicted earlier rules, disclaimers about fines that seemed arbitrary, references to community improvements that I had never seen in action. It was all swirling in my mind. Then my phone buzzed with a new email. It was from the head of the HOA Compliance Committee, likely the same man with a clipboard. The subject read, "Invoice for hedge maintenance." Without preamble, it stated that due to my non-compliance, I owed $220 for emergency trimming services, plus a $50 administrative fee for requiring an on-site crew. If not paid within 14 days, interest would accrue at 1.5% monthly, and the HOA would place a lien on my property. I laughed bitterly. So not only did they trespass, but they wanted me to foot the bill for their questionable actions. Perfect. I saved the email to a dedicated folder I'd created, HOA evidence. If they wanted to intimidate me, they'd have to do better than that. Finally, I spent a quiet moment in the yard, surveying the ragged remains of my beloved hedges. The cut branches were piled in a sad corner, and the entire perimeter looked stark and exposed. I could see traffic on the main road that used to be a distant blur. My sense of privacy felt shattered, and a surge of righteous anger coursed through me again. This wouldn't just be about me. It was about all the homeowners tired of being exploited and bullied. I planned to look beyond the petty annoyances. I suspected there were bigger issues lurking under Timberwood's polite veneer: misuse of funds, phantom accounts, and an HOA board that believed itself untouchable. If my hunch was correct, they were in for quite a wake-up call. The following Monday, I reported to the county administration building, a squat, gray structure housing offices for everything from building permits to budget oversight. My desk was tucked away in a corner of the open plan office. Nearby, row after row of accountants and auditors typed away, their screens full of spreadsheets and ledgers. It was a hub of quiet efficiency. My supervisor, Mr. Albright, greeted me with a warm nod. "Heard you were assigned to the Timberwoods HOA inquiry," he said, handing me a thick binder. They've been on the county's radar for a while now. Reports of questionable finances, aggressive fine enforcement, you name it. This binder contains some preliminary findings. Nothing conclusive yet. Let me know if you need more data. I thanked him and set about my work, starting by combing through the binder. It was packed with copies of complaints from residents, allegations of misappropriated funds, bullying tactics, surprise fees. One complaint detailed how the HOA had inexplicably spent $30,000 on a beautification project, but the only evidence of it was a single new gazebo at the clubhouse that couldn't have cost more than $5,000. Another complaint pointed out that the board president was awarding landscaping contracts to a company run by his cousin. Buried near the back of the binder was a summary of the Timberwoods HOA's financials from the previous year. According to the line items, they had spent $70,000 on community maintenance, but offered no further breakdown. My eyebrows shot up. $70,000 is a lot for landscaping, power washing, and the occasional pool cleaning, even in a moderately sized community. As I dug deeper, I noticed that the HOA's declarations and bylaws were riddled with broad language, allowing the board to define compliance at their own discretion. That alone might not be illegal, but combined with the borderline extortion tactics I'd experienced personally, it painted a troubling picture. At midday, I took my lunch break, stepping outside for a bit of fresh air. But even the bright sunshine did little to ease the knot in my stomach. I knew the HOA board might attempt to stonewall my requests. They might refuse to provide documents or claim ignorance about certain transactions. Still, I was armed with the county's authority. They couldn't outright ignore me without risking legal repercussions. After lunch, I typed up a formal request for additional financial records from Timberwoods. I wanted all vendor contracts, receipts, and bank statements for the last 2 years. The letter concluded with a gentle yet unmistakable reminder that failing to cooperate with a county audit could result in severe penalties. I attached it to an official email, copied Mr. Albright, and hit send. Within 10 minutes, a reply landed in my inbox. It was from the HOA board's attorney, a short message stating that they needed to review the scope of the request and that I should expect a response in due time. Essentially, a polite stall. I half expected it. That evening, I decided to take a stroll through the neighborhood, partly to clear my head, partly to see if I could spot any of that rumored beautification project. My neighbor, Sam, the elderly gentleman who'd watched my hedge fiasco from across the street, was puttering around his front yard. When he saw me, he approached with a sheepish expression. "I'm sorry about your hedges," he said. "I didn't know they'd actually come after you. If I'd realized what they were doing sooner, I would have tried to stop them." "Don't worry," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It wasn't your responsibility. They were sneaky about it. Still, I appreciate the sentiment." Sam sighed, glancing at the large gap where my once grand hedge had stood tall. "You know, they threatened me once, too. Said my front porch step was too high, demanded I shell out money to have it rebuilt or face fines. I ended up paying through the nose just to avoid a lien. Curious, I eyed the porch. It looked sturdy and perfectly normal, nothing that would violate standard building codes." "Did they ever show you an actual code that required a different height?" "Nope," he replied bitterly. "They mumbled something about aesthetic uniformity in the community, but I never got any official documentation. Didn't stop them from bullying me into paying a contractor they recommended. Cost me nearly $1,000. It was yet another story to add to the pile of questionable practices. I thanked Sam, took a few more steps around the cul-de-sac, then made my way toward the clubhouse. It was nearly dusk, and the building's lights were off, but the silhouette of the structure was visible under a few street lamps. There was a modest playground to one side, and behind it, a gazebo, the likely result of that alleged $30,000 beautification project. Even in the twilight, I could see it was a simple wooden structure, nothing fancy. I circled it, noting the wooden benches and the small plaque reading, "Erected by the Timberwoods HOA for the enjoyment of all residents." I tried to visualize how $30,000 could have been spent here. The math simply didn't add up. No landscaping extravagance, no ornate detailing, no special materials, just standard lumber. All around me, the night was growing quiet. The street lamps flickered on, casting a glow on well-manicured lawns. Even though I loved the sense of community and the neat appearance of Timberwoods, I hated the idea that it might be sustained through intimidation and backroom deals. As I headed home, I spotted a figure emerging from a black SUV parked on the curb by the clubhouse. Their face was obscured in the dim light. They paused, as if noticing me. I felt a prickle of unease. But before I could focus on them too long, they slipped into the driver's seat, and the SUV rumbled away. Perhaps just another resident, or maybe someone from the board. Back in my living room, I once again surveyed the tattered stumps of my former hedge. Despite the anger that simmered in me, I felt a flicker of hope. If I did my job right, and if the county's authority backed me up, maybe I could put an end to these brazen tactics. And maybe, just maybe, others in the neighborhood who'd been too scared or exhausted to fight back could finally see some justice. Tomorrow, I would push harder. I'd chase up my requests for financial records, consult my colleagues, and begin the slow grind of a thorough audit. Let the HOA board brace themselves. They had chosen to strike first. Now, the real game was on. By the end of the week, the HOA's attorney had sent me an official response, begrudgingly acknowledging my request. They agreed to produce relevant financial documents by the following Friday, but only under certain conditions. One being that I conduct any interviews with board members at their lawyer's office. They clearly wanted to keep a tight rein on the information flow. In the meantime, I delved deeper into resident testimonies. With each conversation, a clearer picture emerged of an HOA board that had grown intoxicated with its own power. They'd manipulated the community's funds for personal gain, enforced rules selectively, and retreated behind a wall of legalese whenever challenged. One afternoon, while I was reviewing some documents at home, I received a knock on my door. I opened it to find a rotund man with the slicked-back gray hair, my hedge tormentor, standing on my porch. Even in the bright afternoon sun, he managed to look smug. Behind him stood a younger man who I recognized as the board's vice president. I folded my arms, prepared for a confrontation. I didn't realize he made house calls. The man held out a large envelope. "We're here to deliver an updated invoice. The previous one may have had a slight clerical error. This is the correct version." I took the envelope warily. A slight clerical error? Or did you realize your last invoice was nonsense? He ignored my jab and continued. We understand you're an auditor, and we have no intention of obstructing any lawful investigation. That said, it would be best for all parties if we kept our interactions civil. We want you to know that we're a cooperative organization, despite any misunderstandings. The younger man piped up, his tone smooth. Our association prides itself on transparency. We hope we can move forward amicably and settle any concerns you have. Their rehearsed diplomacy set my teeth on edge. I appreciate your presence, but you can't possibly expect me to pay for services I didn't request, especially when you trespassed. They exchanged glances. The older man's voice turned soft and condescending. We believe you'll find we had every right to enforce compliance under the bylaws you signed. If you have a grievance, you're welcome to bring it up at the next board meeting. I let out a humorless laugh. Oh, believe me, I'll be bringing it up. You'll be seeing plenty of me. They offered curt nods and ambled back to their car. I waited until they drove off to open the envelope. Sure enough, it was the same invoice, only this time the administrative fee had been reduced by $5. So generous of them. With a sigh, I tossed it onto my desk. That $5 difference was no olive branch. It was a gimmick to claim they'd corrected an error, perhaps trying to appear cooperative. The next day, I ventured to the law office where the board had insisted on holding our meeting. Their attorney, a sharp woman named Talia, met me in a conference room lined with imposing leather chairs. The board members filed in, including the rotund man, who I learned was named Mr. Pendleton, the younger vice president, and a stern-looking woman with silver-rimmed glasses introduced as the treasurer. I wasted no time laying out the reason for my visit. I'm here under the direction of the county to review the financial records of the Timberwoods HOA. We need to understand how community funds are being utilized, the processes for awarding contracts, and whether dues and fines are applied in accordance with your bylaws and relevant laws. Talia tapped her pen on a stack of folders. We've prepared the documents you requested, though we reserve the right to redact any sensitive personal information. We also expect that any discussions remain confidential until the county releases an official report. Understood, I said, meeting each board member's gaze. However, if any questionable transactions or violations of law are discovered, that information cannot be shielded by confidentiality claims. Mr. Pendleton stiffened, but Talia nodded. Of course. I spent the next hour flipping through the folders, scanning line items for landscaping, pool maintenance, office expenses. It was a tangle, numbers that didn't quite match, vendor invoices marked up beyond industry standards, and repeated references to supplemental board reimbursements with no explanation. It looked suspiciously like certain board members were pocketing funds under vague pretenses. When I politely asked about one invoice, $8, $500 to a landscaping company for a single day's work, Mr. Pendleton offered a vague explanation about exceptional damage that needed urgent repair. I calmly requested receipts, photos, or any documentation to verify the claim. His face reddened, and he muttered something about the receipts being misplaced. The treasurer cleared her throat. We'll locate them. They should be in our files. I nodded, making a note. When you do, please provide them immediately. By the end of the meeting, I had a list of inconsistencies requiring further documentation. The board seemed tense, but I maintained a polite, professional demeanor. No need to tip my hand that I was building a case for a potentially massive financial misconduct report. Outside the law office, I paused to let the gravity of the situation sink in. The HOA board was not only misusing funds, they were brazenly arrogant about it, banking on the assumption that nobody would dare challenge them. But I was not just anybody. I was the newly assigned auditor, a job I took seriously. As I drove home, I allowed myself a small surge of triumph. My research was paying off. I could envision the moment when all the evidence would be laid bare, forcing the board to answer for their misdeeds. The recollection of my ravaged hedges fueled my resolve further. They had turned a personal vendetta into a professional imperative for me. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a strange shape in my yard. Cautiously, I approached and discovered a cardboard box tucked behind the mailbox. Inside lay a thick stack of papers, photocopies of invoices, emails, and notes scribbled with dates and amounts. A single note was taped to the top, written in hurried handwriting. "You might need these. Don't ask who I am." My pulse quickened. An anonymous informant? Or maybe a board member with a conscience? Or a disgruntled ex-employee? Whatever the source, I carefully carried the box inside, locked my door, and began scanning the contents. What I saw made my heart pound. Bank statements with suspicious deposits and withdrawals, checks paid out to names that didn't appear on any vendor list, emails discussing how to hide certain transactions from outsiders. If these documents were genuine, Timberwood's leadership was in far deeper trouble than even I had suspected. I stared at the evidence, picturing the day they stepped onto my property without permission and shredded my hedges. A wave of satisfaction rolled through me. For them, that had been a routine day of compliance enforcement. For me, it had become the catalyst to expose a group of officials who believed they were above accountability. The walls were closing in on the HOA board, and all that was left was to wrap up my audit, submit my findings, and watch justice finally be served. My hedges would grow back in time. But for the Timberwoods HOA, regaining trust after the scandal, that might be a far taller climb, and rightly so. The end.